The snickering started the moment he walked through the chapel doors. His uniform was too tight around the waist, too loose at the shoulders, and the fabric had faded from deep navy blue to a dull gray. The brass buttons, once gleaming with pride, had long lost their shine. While everyone else wore crisp dress uniforms with perfect creases and polished metals, this elderly man shuffled slowly down the aisle, looking like a relic from another time, an out-of-place figure in a crowd of military elite. Whispers spread like wildfire. "Look at that old-timer playing soldier," someone hissed loud enough for others to hear. "Probably picked that up at Goodwill." Quiet laughter followed, a sharp contrast to the solemnity of the moment. To the crowd gathered to honor a decorated three-star general, the man in the faded uniform seemed like a living reminder of faded glory, a ghost from the past who didn't belong in this world of precision and honor. But beneath the worn fabric and mismatched fit, the old man carried a story far richer than any medal could represent. A story of sacrifice, loyalty, and a lifetime of service that transcended appearances. The crowd had no idea the secret he held, the truth buried deep within his faded uniform, waiting to be revealed. Then, as the general's lawyer stepped forward to read the final will, everything changed. The words spoken that day would silence the mockery and ignite a powerful reckoning. What followed would transform that faded uniform from a symbol of shame into a testament of enduring honor, and leave everyone in that chapel forever changed. Welcome to the Veteran Voices. Before we continue with this powerful story about true heroism, tell us in the comments from which city in the world are you watching this video today. And if you believe stories like this deserve to be heard, please hit that subscribe button to help us share these incredible human moments with the world. The funeral of General William Bull Patterson drew the biggest military crowd Washington had seen in years. 3 decades of distinguished service, 2 Purple Hearts, and a Medal of Honor had earned him respect from Pentagon to battlefield. The National Cathedral filled with stars and stripes, colonels, admirals, congressmen, and defense contractors all wearing their finest dress uniforms. Outside, honor guards from every branch stood at attention while media cameras captured the ceremony honoring one of America's most decorated warriors. Inside the cathedral, the atmosphere buzzed with the kind of restrained energy that comes when powerful people gather. Conversations were conducted in hushed tones about military budgets, overseas operations, and political appointments. Medals caught the light streaming through stained glass windows, creating small rainbows across pressed uniforms and perfectly polished shoes. This was military pageantry at its finest, a display of honor, tradition, and absolute precision. In the third row, Colonel James Whitmore adjusted his dress blues and surveyed the crowd with satisfaction. As the general's former aide-de-camp, he had coordinated much of the ceremony and took pride in seeing everything executed flawlessly. Behind him sat Admiral Sarah Chun, resplendent in her Navy dress whites, discussing submarine contracts with a Defense Department official. To his left, General Patricia Hayes whispered with Senator Morrison about upcoming appropriations hearings. These were people accustomed to respect, to deference, to being recognized for their achievements. Their uniforms told stories of rank earned, battles fought, and honors received. Every ribbon had meaning, every star represented responsibility, every decoration carried weight. They were the cream of America's military establishment, gathered to honor one of their own, which made the appearance of Eddie Martinez all the more jarring. He entered the cathedral alone, moving slowly with the careful steps of someone whose joints had endured 8 decades of wear. His dress uniform, if it could still be called that, belonged to another era. The blue fabric had faded to an indeterminate shade somewhere between navy and gray. His trousers were too short, revealing white socks above scuffed black shoes. The jacket pulled tight across his midsection while hanging loose at the shoulders, as if it had been tailored for a different body entirely. But it wasn't just the poor fit that drew attention. The uniform itself seemed ancient. The style was decades out of date, the fabric worn thin in places, and the brass buttons had developed a greenish patina that spoke of years in storage. His single row of ribbons looked faded and slightly crooked, as if they had been pinned on hastily without attention to proper alignment. The whispers started immediately. "Jesus, look at that," murmured Lieutenant Colonel Barnes to his companion. "Did security let in a vagrant? That's not even a real uniform." replied Major Stevens with barely concealed disgust. Look at those ribbons. Probably ordered them online. Behind them, Colonel Patricia Walsh shook her head in disapproval. It's disrespectful, showing up to the general's funeral looking like that. Some people have no shame. The mockery spread in ripples throughout the cathedral. Cell phones appeared discreetly as people photographed the elderly man in his ill-fitting uniform. Social media posts were already being composed about the wannabe soldier who had somehow infiltrated a gathering of genuine military heroes. The consensus was clear. This was an old man playing dress-up, probably a veteran wannabe or someone suffering from delusions about his own service record. Eddie Martinez seemed oblivious to the attention he was generating. He found an empty spot in one of the back pews and sat down heavily. His breathing slightly labored from the walk down the aisle. His weathered hands rested on his knees, and his eyes fixed on the flag-draped casket at the front of the cathedral. His expression carried something the mockery-focused crowd failed to notice. Genuine grief mixed with a kind of reverent respect that had nothing to do with ceremony and everything to do with personal loss. The formal service began with traditional military honors. A chaplain offered prayers, followed by eulogs from the general's colleagues and family members. Stories were shared about his leadership during the Gulf War, his innovations in military strategy, and his mentorship of younger officers. His widow, Margaret, spoke briefly about his dedication not just to his country, but to the soldiers who served under his command. Throughout the ceremony, Eddie Martinez sat quietly in his back pew, occasionally wiping his eyes with a handkerchief that looked as old as his uniform. The whispers around him continued, though somewhat more subdued during the formal proceedings. Poor old guy probably thinks he actually served, someone muttered during a pause between speakers. Dementia? Most likely, replied another voice. Family should keep him at home. What none of them knew was that Eddie Martinez had indeed served, for 3 tours in Vietnam, earning 2 Bronze Stars and a Purple Heart in combat that most of the sneering observers had only read about in history books. What they also didn't know was that the faded, ill-fitting uniform he wore was the same one he had worn 47 years earlier when he pulled a burning tank commander to safety during an ambush outside Da Nang. That tank commander had been 2nd Lieutenant William Patterson. As the formal eulogies concluded, the cathedral fell silent in preparation for the reading of the general's will. This was unusual. Most military funerals didn't include public readings of final testaments. But General Patterson had specifically requested that certain provisions be shared with those gathered to honor his memory. Margaret Patterson's attorney, Harrison Wells, approached the podium with a leather portfolio. He was a distinguished man in his 60s, wearing a dark suit that contrasted sharply with the sea of military uniforms surrounding him. His voice carried clearly throughout the cathedral as he began to read. General Patterson asked me to share several provisions from his final will and testament with those gathered here today. He felt it was important that certain acknowledgments be made in the presence of his military family. The crowd listened politely, expecting routine bequests to military charities or scholarships for soldiers' children. What they heard instead would challenge everything they thought they knew about heroism, honor, and the true meaning of service. To the United States Army, I leave my collection of military history books, with the hope that future officers will learn from the past as I tried to do. To the families of the soldiers who died under my command, I leave my profound apologies and the promise that their sacrifice meant everything to me. Wells paused, looking up from the document to scan the crowd. To my truest friend, Staff Sergeant Eddie Martinez, who is present here today, the man still wearing the same uniform he wore when he pulled me from that burning tank in Vietnam, I leave my Medal of Honor. Eddie earned it more than I ever did. The cathedral erupted, not in applause, but in gasps of shock and confusion. Heads turned toward the back pews, searching for this Eddie Martinez who had somehow earned such extraordinary recognition from the deceased general. The whispers that had been mocking just moments before now carried a different tone entirely. Did he say Eddie Martinez? The old man in the back? That can't be right. But Harrison Wells wasn't finished reading. Eddie Martinez saved my life on March 15, 1977, when our convoy was ambushed outside Da Nang. When my tank took a direct hit and caught fire, Eddie ran through enemy gunfire to pull me from the wreckage. He carried me 300 yards to safety while taking shrapnel in his back and leg. The Army wanted to recommend him for the Medal of Honor, but Eddie refused. He said he was just doing his job. The silence in the cathedral was now complete. Every phone had been lowered, every whisper had stopped. The hundreds of military officers who had been sneering at the old man's appearance now sat frozen in their seats, beginning to understand the magnitude of their mistake. Wells continued reading, his voice growing stronger with each word. Eddie Martinez never sought recognition for his actions that day. He never told the story to anyone who wasn't there. He never used his heroism to advance his career or gain special treatment. When he left the army, he went home to San Antonio, worked as a mechanic for 40 years, and raised 3 children with his late wife Maria. He attended military funerals when he could, always wearing the same uniform from his service days, always sitting in the back, always honoring the fallen without calling attention to himself. The crowd was beginning to turn now, hundreds of faces shifting toward the back of the cathedral where Eddie Martinez still sat quietly, his weathered hands now clasped tightly together. His eyes remained fixed on the general's casket, and his expression showed no satisfaction at this public vindication, only continued grief for the loss of his friend. General Patterson wrote the following words about Eddie Martinez. Wells continued, "In a world full of people who demand recognition for minor accomplishments, Eddie Martinez performed the greatest act of heroism I ever witnessed and never mentioned it again. He saved my life, and in doing so, he made possible every achievement I earned afterward. Every medal I received, every promotion I earned, every soldier I helped train, all of it was possible because Eddie Martinez ran into enemy fire to pull a wounded officer from a burning tank." The shame in the cathedral was now palpable. Officers who had laughed at the old man's appearance, who had questioned his right to wear a uniform, who had mocked his faded ribbons and ill-fitting jacket, now sat in stunned silence as they realized they had insulted the very man their deceased general considered the greatest hero he had ever known. Colonel Whitmore, who had organized the ceremony, felt his face burning with embarrassment. He had noticed the old man's appearance and had privately wondered why security hadn't screened him more carefully. Now he understood that he had been in the presence of genuine heroism and had been too blind to recognize it. Admiral Chun, who had whispered jokes about the uniform, now stared at her hands, unable to look toward the back of the cathedral where the real hero sat quietly accepting recognition he had never sought. Wells wasn't finished with the will. "Eddie Martinez represents everything I tried to be during my military career but never quite achieved. He acted without hesitation when lives were at stake. He refused credit when credit was offered. He continued serving his community long after his military service ended. And he honored fallen soldiers by showing up to their funerals, not for ceremony or recognition, but because he understood that heroes should never be mourned alone." Now the crowd began to turn fully toward Eddie Martinez. What they saw was not the pathetic figure they had mocked earlier, but an elderly man whose bearing, despite his age and worn uniform, carried the unmistakable dignity of someone who had faced the worst moments life could offer and had responded with courage. His uniform might have been faded and ill-fitting, but it was worn with the kind of honest pride that comes from having earned the right to wear it. His ribbons might have been crooked and dulled with age, but they represented actions taken in combat, not ceremonies attended in safety. His appearance might not have met the standards of military protocol, but his character exceeded any standard that mattered. Harrison Wells looked directly at Eddie Martinez as he read the final provision. "The Medal of Honor that I received for my actions during the Vietnam War rightfully belongs to the man who made those actions possible. Eddie Martinez not only saved my life, he saved the lives of every soldier I was able to help during the 40 years of service that followed. I hope that by publicly acknowledging his heroism, I can partially repay a debt that can never be fully settled." The cathedral remained silent for a long moment. Then, slowly, people began to stand, not in organized military fashion, but in scattered recognition of what they had just learned. A few officers stood first, then others followed, until the entire congregation was on its feet. But Eddie Martinez remained seated. He looked overwhelmed, not by the recognition, but by the public nature of it. This was a man who had spent decades avoiding attention, who had performed the greatest act of heroism imaginable, and then returned to ordinary life without expecting or wanting credit. General Hayes, who had whispered earlier about the inappropriateness of the old man's appearance, now walked toward the back of the cathedral. Her steps were hesitant, weighted with shame and newfound respect. When she reached Eddie's pew, she stopped and rendered a perfect military salute. "Sir," she said quietly, "it is an honor to be in your presence." Eddie Martinez looked up at her with eyes that held no anger or resentment despite the mockery he had endured. Instead, his expression carried only the gentle sadness of someone who had lived long enough to understand that people often judge by appearances rather than character. He stood slowly, his movements careful and deliberate, and returned the salute with the precision of someone whose muscle memory retained decades of military bearing. Then he extended his hand, and General Hayes shook it with a respect she had never shown to any officer, regardless of rank. The gesture seemed to break a dam. Other officers began approaching, forming a line to shake hands with the man they had dismissed just an hour earlier. Each offered apologies, expressions of respect, and acknowledgments of their own failures of perception. Eddie Martinez accepted each gesture with grace, offering quiet words of forgiveness to people who had revealed their own character flaws through their treatment of him. He bore no grudges, showed no satisfaction at their discomfort, and displayed no bitterness about the years of invisibility he had endured. Margaret Patterson, the general's widow, made her way through the crowd to reach Eddie. When she arrived, tears were streaming down her face. "Eddie," she said simply, "Bill talked about you all the time. He said you were the best man he ever knew." They embraced briefly, two elderly people sharing grief for someone who had connected their lives in ways that transcended rank, ceremony, or public recognition. As the cathedral began to empty, Eddie Martinez prepared to leave as quietly as he had arrived. But now his solitary walk was different. Officers stood at attention as he passed. Cameras that had earlier captured his appearance mockingly now recorded his dignified exit with respect. The man who had entered as an object of ridicule left as a recognized hero. Outside the cathedral, the afternoon sun illuminated the steps where Eddie Martinez paused to catch his breath. His faded uniform looked the same as it had when he arrived, but everything else had changed. The officers filing past him now understood that heroism comes in many forms, that dignity cannot be measured by the newness of one's uniform, and that true character reveals itself not in moments of ceremony, but in moments of crisis. Colonel Whitmore approached Eddie as he prepared to leave. "Sir, I owe you an apology. We all do. Your service, your sacrifice, we should have recognized it immediately." Eddie Martinez looked at the younger officer with a slight smile. "Son," he said quietly, "the uniform doesn't make the soldier. The soldier makes the uniform. And sometimes, the most important service happens when nobody's watching." He walked slowly toward the street, where a taxi waited to take him back to his modest life in San Antonio. Behind him, the military elite of America stood on the cathedral steps, forever changed by their encounter with genuine heroism disguised in a faded uniform. The Medal of Honor that Eddie Martinez inherited that day would eventually find its place in the Smithsonian, donated by a man who believed that such honors belonged to the public rather than on private shelves. But the real legacy of that afternoon was the lesson learned by hundreds of military officers about the difference between appearance and substance, between ceremony and service, between recognition and worth. Sometimes the most important people in any room are the ones we notice last. Sometimes heroism wears faded fabric and tarnished buttons. And sometimes the greatest teachers are those who show us our own failures not through anger or resentment, but through quiet dignity that makes our smallness impossible to ignore. This story was brought to you by the Veteran Voices. Before we leave you today, here's our question. Have you ever known someone who never asked for recognition but deserved more than anyone else? Someone whose true character was hidden beneath a surface that others were too quick to judge? Tell us in the comments what they taught you about looking beyond appearances and recognizing real worth. And if you think stories like this need to be heard, hit that subscribe button to support the channel. We'll see you in the next one.